Dearborn. It's been some years since I was last here. My wife and I lived in Ann Arbor for 16 years. But in 2007, we moved to California, where we now live. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I enjoy hard questions. I'm a Christian, and a question which oftentimes arises, well, how do you reconcile your Christian faith with science? It's oftentimes assumed by people that there's intrinsic conflict between science and Christianity, and that's the topic that I'm going to be addressing this evening. So I want to start off by saying when people talk about the scientific worldview, what they really mean by that is what's called naturalism. Naturalism is the view that the physical world is all that exists, it's all that's real, and also maintains that everything ultimately can be explained in terms of physical laws. So there's nothing but the physical world, and physical laws explain everything. And the idea is that science tells us that naturalism is true, or at least raises the question, does the success of science provide strong support for naturalism? I want to start off with a story that illustrates this. Napoleon was tutored by Pierre Laplace. Pierre Laplace was one of the most brilliant minds of his age. Perhaps if you ask who was the brightest mind of his age, he would certainly be one who would be a candidate for that. But he actually tutored Napoleon, a little bit like Aristotle was the tutor for Alexander the Great. But Napoleon picked up a book that Pierre Laplace wrote on the solar system. And I don't know whether Napoleon read the book or whether he simply had heard about the content in it. But he, in conversation with Laplace, was surprised that there was no mention of God within it. So he asked, why is there no reference to God in this book on the solar system? I mean, after all, talking about the solar system, surely you'd bring God in the question. And Pierre Laplace's response to that was, I have no need of that hypothesis. Physics is able to account for the solar system. Don't bring God into the picture at all. So the question becomes, is God needed to explain anything in the natural world? We've come a long way since the time of Pierre Laplace, and we're able to understand how DNA works to a large degree. There's lots of things we don't know yet, but from the smallest scale to the largest scale, we have a good understanding of what's there, and it doesn't seem as though there are gaps where God needs to do things to bring about the world as we see it. So an atheist response is, no, the success of science gives us good reason to think that everything will be explicable in terms of natural laws. Another way of putting that is they would suppose that the success of science tells us that there's strong support for naturalism. Now, the question is, what does one make of that? Is that really a good argument? I want to also add here that oftentimes they will say belief in God was really due to ignorance that we had in the past. So in the past, we didn't know why things work, so we invoke spirits and God, why things happen. But science has brought the light of science has dispelled this darkness of ignorance. So the idea is that science displaces God, displaces religion, displaces Christianity. There are problems with naturalism, for a variety of problems which I could address. I'm going to mention two, but I'll spend most of my time looking at the second one. The first one has to do with consciousness and mind. The conscious mind and personhood do not fit in a world where everything ultimately is physical. You have a world where everything is physical things interacting in physical ways. It doesn't seem as though mind appears anywhere. But quite clearly, mind is part of our physical world. We have minds, we have conscious experiences. What does one make of that? There's a famous atheist philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who in 2012 came out with a book by Oxford University Press entitled Mind and Cosmos. But the subtitle was the real grabber, and it's a grabber because Thomas Nagel is a staunch atheist. Says he does not wish that the Christian faith is true, it doesn't wish it were true. The subtitle was Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Concept of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Now, he's not anti-evolution at all, but the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the neo-Darwinian theory, was an attempt to give a purely physical explanation of evolution. And Thomas Nagel thinks if, in fact, the world is not explicable simply in terms of physics, then a purely physical explanation is not going to suffice, because after all, a major feature of not only us, but all the higher organisms is that we have conscious states. Your dog, your cat has conscious states, and why would that arise within evolution? So the neo-Darwinian thesis or project fails. It's not that there's not a lot of things which it has right, but he thinks that neo-Darwinian thesis and naturalism, materialism, is almost certainly false. I may sometimes use the word naturalism. Naturalism is simply the newer word used for materialism or physicalism. The second problem that I want to focus on more than that is the question of, the claim I want to make is that the naturalist argument fails to distinguish what I call order of nature miracles and specific point miracles. Now, you might say, well, I haven't heard those expressions before. Well, it's because I made them up. So I have to explain what I mean by that. But I think if you understand what I mean by that, you'll come a long way towards understanding how the Christian faith and science can be related to each other, and how I think they should be related. An absence of miracles accords well with biblical Christianity, I would maintain. So the fact that science is able to explain everything from the smallest scale to the largest scale, I think is not an argument against the Christian faith. I do think the success of science gives us good reason to believe there are no order of nature miracles. Now again, I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. But where I'm going is saying that Christianity actually accords quite well with an absence of order of nature miracles. And the success of science is actually silent with respect to whether or not specific point miracles happen. So let me try to clarify what I mean by that. So the order of nature, or the ongoing process that we see year by year, day by day, it's not simply the fundamental laws of physics as part of the order of nature, but the way in which cells divide, organisms develop. All those things are part of the order of nature as I'm talking about at this point. Specific events are those events which make up the order of nature, but they're specific events that take place in time. And correlating with those two ideas are what I call order of nature miracles and specific point miracles. Now, an order of nature miracle, I'll give an example. Isaac Newton thought that every once in a while God needs to adjust the orbits of the planets to keep them stable. The reason he thought that was he recognized that the planets would have a gravitational effect upon one another, and he thought that over time that could destabilize the orbits and cause the Earth either to spin into the sun or to spin off into space, and therefore God needs to adjust the orbits of the planets every once in a while to keep them stable. Actually, 100 years later, Pierre Laplace, who I mentioned, showed that Isaac Newton was wrong on that. Another example that I'd mention is cellular differentiation. When life begins, there are stem cells. So you have a bunch of stem cells, a cluster of stem cells, but at some point, a stem cell doesn't divide and simply become two more stem cells. A stem cell divides and becomes two muscle cells, or it becomes two nerve cells. Or you might have a nerve cell which divides, and the cells which come out of that are not the same kind of nerve cells, the first cell. Now, it's important in the development of any organism that cells differentiate in the right way, at the right time, the right place. So, for instance, if you think about the neurons in your head, by the time you're an adult, you'll have close to an amazing trillion neurons within your brain. But to have a brain that functions, it's not simply enough that you have that many neurons within your brain. You have to have the right kinds of neurons in the right place for the brain to be able to function. You have to have some of the neurons have these long axons, and they have to have the right neurons in the right place. So your brain is wired in a way, one might say, for it to be able to work. Now, how is it that these cells become the right cells, the right place, the right time? And I once heard a preacher who said science is unable to account for cellular differentiation. And here's a gap that science is unable to account for, so see, science still needs God. Well, if in fact God needed to do miracles to have cells differentiate the right place and the right time, basically what it means that God would switch on and off genes to make the cell become the right kind of cell in the right place at the right time, because it's when genes are turned on and off that determines what kind of cell it becomes. And it would mean that God manually, as it were, miraculously is making every cell that differentiates become the right kind of cell in the right place, which would be a rather massive amount of miracles that God would have to do to sustain the world. Now, there's still some questions we have about it. We're beginning to understand more things about cellular differentiation, but it seems likely to me that we will have a physical explanation for why it is cells differentiate when they do. That there'll be environmental cues which will trigger the turning on and turning off of cells, and that we don't have to have God doing miracles. But if he did do that, that would clearly be an order of nature miracle, something God needs to do on a regular basis, typically to sustain the world as we see around us. Now, specific point miracles are miracles that God would do at a specific point in time for a specific reason, for a specific purpose. The example of that would be the virgin birth of Jesus. So it's not part of the natural process by which babies are born, but if there's a virgin birth of Jesus, it means you have the DNA from Mary, and it'd be a rather massive miracle on God's part to get the right nucleic acids to actually line up to result in a man being born of a woman. But that would be a specific point miracle. And no matter how much you understood how the process works in how babies come about and how cells divide and how a baby develops in his mother's womb, that wouldn't tell you whether or not God would ever do an exception to it like the virgin birth of Jesus claims to be. So specific point miracles are miracles that God does at specific points for specific purposes. Interesting enough, you look through Scripture and all of the miracles in the Bible, with the possible exception of creation itself. It's a little bit hard to know how to categorize that. But all the miracles of the Bible are specific point miracles. They are not order of nature miracles. And when I find Christians trying to find things within the order of nature that science isn't able to account for yet, so you're looking for something we don't have any precedent with the Scripture to believe actually is there. So I'm going to come back to the claim that an absence of order of nature miracles accords well with biblical Christianity. Again, think of Isaac Newton with his planetary orbits. Now, Isaac Newton, God, presumably, could create a world where he would need to adjust the orbits of the planets every once in a while. Christians believe that God is both all-powerful, and being all-powerful, he can create any possible world that he wants, and he's all-knowing, and being all-knowing, that means that he knows all the possibilities. So God can create a world where he needs to adjust the orbit of planets, but clearly one possibility is that God can create a world where physics dictates the stability of the planetary orbits. What Laplace showed was that, yes, the planets do have an effect on each other, but over time they cancel each other out, and he showed by physical calculation and that the orbit of the Earth will vary within a narrow band, but it won't go beyond that narrow band, so that stability doesn't require God. Physics accounts for itself. So the question now arises, should we be surprised that God and that we live in a world like this? Or should we be surprised that God would create a world where physics is how the stability of planetary orbits is sustained? Now, typically, when one asks, what would God do? We're on fairly thin ice, because after all, we're not God, and God's perspective is different from ours. But from a human standpoint, suppose you're an engineer, and you're designing a machine, and you have two alternatives. One possibility is design the machine such that every year you need to do annual adjustments to it. But you can also design the machine such that it will be self-adjusting. It seems to me that from an engineering standpoint, the much more elegant solution is to build a machine which is self-adjusting. Now, that doesn't mean that God would have the same kind of preferences that we would have, but if in fact the world seems to be like what an engineer would want to do, should we be surprised that an all-powerful, all-knowing God would choose to create a world which in fact is exquisitely ordered? Should we be surprised that God has created a world perhaps where there is no need for God to do miracles simply to sustain it? So the thesis that I want to advance is that God has created an exquisitely ordered universe, and at no point does he need to do periodic miracles to sustain that order. And that's a thesis which I maintain fits quite well with what Scripture says. It does talk about God bringing rain and storms, but if there's anything supernatural going on that, other than God working through the flexibility of quantum physics and the chaotic character of meteorological systems, that kind of thing, that those are specific point miracles, and it's not saying that God needs to do something simply to sustain weather patterns as they normally happen. So this does not, but if there are no gaps, if there are no places where miracles have to be brought in for God to sustain the order of nature, This does not imply that God never does miracles at specific points for specific purposes. The key point here is that success of science, although providing support for a gapless order of nature, is silent about whether specific point miracles ever occur. If we ask ourselves, have specific point miracles ever happen, that's a historical question, and we need to look at those things and investigate it that way. The success of science isn't going to tell us one way or another whether or not God does exceptions. Now, at this point, I want to raise an objection. There are actually a variety of objections which one could raise, but one objection is as follows, is that science is not only concerned with the order of nature itself. Science is concerned with trying to explain why things happen as they do, why specific things happen as they do. So suppose a bridge collapses, or the bridge that the Verrazano Narrows Bridge that collapsed under it's got swinging, and so engineers go back. Why did this happen? Why did this building collapse? Why this engineering failure? Why did this happen? When we're trying to figure out how cancer works, trying to figure out why specific things happen. So we're concerned not only about general processes, but oftentimes we're concerned about specific events, and we're concerned about predictions about specific events. So we want these general laws to be able to predict what's going to happen. So scientists are concerned about individual events and not just general processes. So the person would object that science actually is concerned about those things. Furthermore, science, when it looks at reports of miracles, they look at report miracles, they often are able to investigate a reported miracle and find either that the reported event never happened, or that the event happened, but actually there's a very plausible, good scientific explanation for how one can account for it. So either way, the conclusion is that a miracle did not happen. So the contention is that even though you're admitting the possibility that there's specific point miracles, surely science has some application of that, and science thus far doesn't give us any reason for thinking that specific miracles actually happen. So I want to respond to that objection. Typically I have a Q&A, I'll respond to other objections which people will come up with, but I'll limit my presentation today on this one objection. So the first part of my reply is that false reports of miracles are to be expected whether or not there are any actual miracles. It's a little bit like UFOs. You expect that people will make stories about UFOs. Sometimes people just fabricate stories because they like attention for themselves. Sometimes there are people who are into sort of this belief that there are aliens out there, and they think they see things, or imagine themselves seeing things that don't really exist. You're going to have lots of people coming up with stories that are false stories, that don't actually reflect an actual appearance of an alien. Likewise, you're going to have people who report miracles, and one has to be dubious about those. I remember one time hearing the report of a miracle or of a healer in Argentina who specialized in teeth filling. And I thought, that sounds rather dubious to me. But there are people who will give those kinds of reports, or people who will be basically people who are pulling the wool over people's eyes and know when they faint in these healing meetings, and they're taken over a prayer room, and in this story their cavities are filled. Now, is a miracle taking place where suddenly their cavities are being filled, or do you have a sort of a person here who has a scheme where the person is kept under while they do some dental work, and lo and behold, the cavities are filled? I think a scientific investigation of that would not have too much difficulty of being able to show that no, that didn't actually happen. But so you expect that there's going to be false reports. The problem with false reports, whether it's UFOs or about miracles, is how does one actually get at the question, well, are there any actual ones? And I mentioned the case of UFOs in part because most atheists I know actually are quite open to the possibility that there's extraterrestrial intelligence out there. And some of them think there surely there are intelligent beings out there. And it could be, if there are, that someday they would come and visit us. So the fact that there are false reports about unidentified flying objects does not give us any reason whatsoever for believing that there are no intelligent aliens out there, or even that there could be a genuine report. What it does do is it creates all this static, one might say. You've got all these false reports, and to know if an actual one actually happened, you have to have a fairly high bar of evidence to weed out the false reports from the true reports. The question is, how high should that bar be? Atheists oftentimes say the bar has to be extremely high. In fact, I've known some atheists say the bar ought to be so high that any naturalistic explanation, no matter how far-fetched it may seem to be, is going to win out over the idea that a miracle happened. Well, I'm not quite sure why it is they presume that case, unless they presume that there's almost zero probability that God exists, and so therefore one is going to opt for any naturalistic explanation. You get a similar kind of thing when it comes to, is the order that we see in the universe a result of a multiverse, or as a result of divine action designing the world as it is right now? Some people assume, well, it's of course more plausible. There's an infinite number of universes, and you have the extreme improbabilities, and only 1 out of 10 to the 50th power universes comes out just right, but we have to be in such a universe. Well, how is it that those always win out over the idea that there's a designer? Let me insert here that I think most atheists, if you're confronted with something that appears to involve an incredibly small probability for our universe to be habitable for life, would say there must be some better explanation than that, rather than simply saying that our universe is 1 out of the extremely small amount. There is a Roger Penrose, who's a physicist, mathematician, in a book called The Emperor's New Mind, gave a calculation of what's the likelihood that our universe would start off with as low entropy as it actually has, given the time that's occurred and the entropy, level of entropy we see right now. And the figure that he came up with is the probability of happening simply by chance, and the theory of entropy has a chance element built into it, is 1 over 10 to the 10th power, and then that exponent of 10 raised to the 120th power. Now, he didn't say, well, in an infinite universe that'll happen, so no big surprise. Rather, he said, surely there must be something about Big Bang scenarios that simply dictate low entropy. Is it ad hoc? Yeah, it's ad hoc. We have no physical principles that would tell us that that's the case. But it does seem to me that that is a better conclusion to draw than believe that it was actually 1 out of 1 over 10 to the 10th power to the 120th power, that that's actually the kind of universe we live in. So it seems to me that even as an atheist, rather than appealing to a multiverse with incredibly small probabilities, one should think there's a better naturalistic explanation. But if you think there's a better explanation, naturalistic explanation, why is it that a theological explanation, or that God did it, should always lose? So it seems to me that if some other explanation is there, it ought to come up. So when one is looking at probabilities that are required for life, and the probabilities get smaller and smaller and smaller, what actually happens is that other alternatives, relative to that, they raise. So when you have different alternatives, if they're mutually exclusive, and you find that one of the options is less probable than your first thought, then that decreased probability there means an increase in probability for the others. So as one goes down, all the ships rise, as it were. Well, one of those other possibilities, unless you discount as a possibility, is that God actually designed the universe that way. So when people appeal to a multiverse and say God certainly didn't have anything to do with it, the ship of theism, of design, of God, actually rises as those probabilities get smaller and smaller. But to say that it's just simply a chance, a multiverse, when the probabilities get small, is not a good explanation. And the reason why they don't take seriously God as an explanation is that they want to give it arbitrarily small probabilities. No matter how small the other probabilities will be, then God gets an arbitrarily smaller probability so that anything else wins out over it. But the success of science does not give us that. Success of science, I'm saying, is really neutral with respect to specific point miracles here. And it's also neutral with respect to what brought about the universe as we know. That's an unanswered question at this point. We may at some point be able to have more of a scientific handle on it, but we don't have a handle on it right now. And let me add that even if some demonstration occurs that there is a multiverse, from a theological standpoint, the Bible doesn't tell us that this creation, this universe, is the only one God created. So there's nothing theologically incompatible with God creating a multiverse. And if this multiverse happens to have a theory of everything that accounts for the whole ensemble of all these infinite number of universes or vast number of universes, if that theory of everything seems fine-tuned, then you still have some reason to think there must be a fine-tuner or God behind it. So anyway, false reports are expected whether or not there are miracles out there. Plus, one needs to know, in thinking about this claim that science has revealed false reports to be bogus, is that many reports cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed. And what happens is when you're investigating, suppose you were investigating an actual miracle. A scientist investigating would not say, here we have an actual miracle. Rather, his conclusion would be, well, we don't have an explanation for it yet. It clearly wouldn't be in the category of not a miracle, but it would be in the category of unsolved. So you really have three possibilities when you're considering the case of what a scientific investigation of a miracle, a claim of a miracle would reveal. And that scientific explanation has that there is either no miracle, but you'd actually probably have more marks in the not unsolved, but you wouldn't have any marks at all in the column of miracle. So if a person said, the scientific evidence weighs against belief in miracles, but when you look at it, no matter what you're going to do, it's not going to show up because science doesn't tell you that a miracle happened. From a scientific standpoint, extraordinary event doesn't tell you a miracle happened. Even if you could scientifically investigate, say, the resurrection of Jesus and didn't have any explanation for it, you're not going to put it in the maybe a miracle column from a scientific standpoint. From a scientific standpoint, you simply say unsolved because science doesn't go beyond what science is able to demonstrate. But not being able to go beyond it doesn't entitle one to infer that no actual miracles happen. In conclusion, then, there is good reason for thinking that naturalism is false. Or if I went back and talked about the consciousness one, I actually give a lecture that I call What is a Person? And the problem for consciousness is a worse problem than most naturalists and materialists actually acknowledge. But if there's, I would maintain there is good reason for thinking that naturalism is false. It seems that the nature of reality is not just physical, that the naturalist, materialist view of the world is actually missing something significant. It's got lots of things right, but it doesn't seem as though conscious states are simply some mechanical process that is a conscious state, but we don't understand yet how it is a conscious process. Next, the success of science, far from conflicting from the Christian faith, accords well with it. Now, whether God has performed miracles at specific points in history is a question that must be examined historically. The success of science is neutral with respect to that question. So what I encourage you to think about is to reflect on what the success of science actually tells you. There are other issues that are worth dealing with. So one might ask, why is there as much suffering as there is in the natural world? But that is not a scientific question. That's a question, is a theological, philosophical question. And again, that's another topic I'd love to embrace. But it's not science which comes in there. The fact that death is part of the environment around us and part of the ecosystem is not a scientific problem. It's just part of what science tells us. The success of science by itself, I would maintain, is neutral with respect to whether God exists. And if there's reason for thinking that naturalism is false, one ought to consider other alternatives, and theism is certainly, I would maintain, an alternative that one must investigate. Thank you very much.